Deep state totalitarians are working fiendishly to turn the United Nations into a global government. They say all of that themselves. So in this mini-series where we're talking about solutions to the problem of the deep state, the threat posed to Americans and our liberties by the deep state. And so today we're going to focus on something that would represent a devastating blow to the deep state's agenda, and that is getting the United States out of the United Nations. Stay tuned and I'll tell you more. First, you might be asking, why would we want to get out of the United Nations? Well, a better question would be, why would we not want to get out of the United Nations? It's costing us $10 billion plus per year. But there are so many reasons why we want to get out of the United Nations. So, first of all, the UN was created by deep state occultists and actual communists to serve as the future global government. And this now is clear. It's documented history. On the Soviet side, one of the worst mass murdering butchers to ever walk on this planet, Joseph Stalin, sent his minion, Vyacheslav Molotov. That's the man, of course, responsible for the Soviet Union's alliance with the National Socialists, the Nazi regime, when they decided to gobble up other European nations before World War II. On the U.S. side, which they created the UN after World War II, we sent this guy called Alger Hiss. Now, we found out some years after Hiss served as the chairman of the conference that created the UN that he was a Soviet agent, so we threw him in prison. He also filled the ranks of the new UN with Soviet agents, including Adler and Virginius Frank Coe, Lawrence Duggan, Noel Field, Harold Glasser, Victor Perlow, Nathan Silvermaster, Harry Dexter White, and many, many more. He also took all of the deep state globalists when they were gathering in San Francisco to create the UN down to the Bohemian Grove. If you haven't seen our episode on the Bohemian Grove, you should go check it out. This is a very, very creepy secret organization of the elites. They get together and they do occult rituals. They've got this big 40-foot stone owl, and they burn what they claim is an effigy of a child at the foot of this 40-foot stone owl. It's all very, very creepy. So go watch that episode if you haven't seen it in Behind the Deep State. Now, they've been pretty open about the fact that this was supposed to be a world government from the beginning. John Foster Dulles, he served as Secretary of State. He also was the co-founder of the Council on Foreign Relations, probably deep state headquarters here in the United States. If you haven't seen our episode on that, go check it out. Now, he wrote a book that was published in 1950 called War or Peace, and this is what he said. The United Nations represents not a final stage in the development of world order, but only a primitive stage. Okay, it's only a primitive stage. Therefore, he said, its primary task is to create the conditions which will make possible a more highly developed organization. Okay, very, very clear where they're going, guys. A more highly developed global organization. And he actually explains, as we get a little further into the book, what he means by that. He actually argues that the UN Charter is suitable for building a world government. And he says, and I'm quoting here, I have never seen any proposal made for collective security with teeth in it, or for world government, or for world federalism, or world federation, which could not be carried out either by the United Nations or under the United Nations Charter. Okay, when you read the UN Charter, what you'll see is it is a blueprint for global government. They even claim the authority to send our armed forces into harm's way, our American armed forces. And to this day, globalists are still pretty open about the fact that they plan to turn the UN into a global government. Here's George H.W. Bush speaking on how the UN will be in charge of the New World Order, as he refers to it. Check it out.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
All right, so you heard Mr. Bush himself explaining it. Basically, the New World Order will be a world in which the rule of law, by that they mean the UN global rule of law, will govern the conduct of nations, okay? That's what he said. That's not what I'm saying. He also said we'll use the UN's peacekeeping role, by which he means the UN's military forces, to bring about the vision of the UN's founders. We already talked about the UN founders: communists, deep state occultists, traitors, and other totalitarians. Now, speaking of global law, the rule of law will govern the conduct of nations. Before he left office, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who was the head of the UN until pretty recently, until it was taken over by socialist Antonio Guterres, he actually repeatedly called the UN the Parliament of Humanity. Now, stop and think about what that means. A parliament is a law-making body. Okay, the UN General Assembly is made up not of elected representatives, but of gangsters and mass murderers and dictators and tin pot tyrants of various sorts. And they are now calling this openly the Parliament of Humanity. Now, they've got Agenda 2030, which Ban Ki-moon called the Global Declaration of Interdependence. The head of the UN General Assembly at that time, Peter Thompson, called it the Master Plan for Humanity. And a big part of this, another reason why we want to get out of the UN, is because they completely reject the American understanding of rights. Right? In our Declaration of Independence, our founding fathers said it was a self-evident truth that God endowed each of us with unalienable rights, God-given rights. Nobody can take those away. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Right? These came straight out of the Bible. God said, "Thou shalt not murder," and so you have a right to your life. God said, "Thou shalt not steal," and so you have a right to your property. And on the list goes. Right? The UN, on the other hand, takes the exact opposite approach. If you read their International Declaration of Human Rights, you'll see there is no God, there are no unalienable rights. In fact, they actually tell you that you have no rights. If you go down to Article 29, they actually say in there that none of these rights and privileges shall be used contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. Okay, that's why they can say our gun rights are a violation of human rights. That's why they can say free speech is a violation of human rights. It's because they don't actually recognize God-given rights. They don't recognize rights as negative rights, something that God has endowed us with that we get to enjoy. Those are privileges that the UN and governments and international agreements grant to us. Okay, this is a disgusting and perverted understanding of rights, and the two systems are not compatible. Right? If you like your God-given rights, then you've got to stick with the American system. If you want UN privileges that can be revoked from you on a whim, that cannot be used contrary to the purposes and principles of the UN, then hey, let's stay in the UN, right? More reasons to get out of the UN, as if we didn't have enough with the fact that they're trying to steal our freedom, they're trying to come for our guns, they're trying to restrict our freedom of speech, they're trying to demand all sorts of unconstitutional programs. They also have all the trappings of a global government already, right? And when I say they want to become the global government, they're almost there, folks. What do you think of when you think of a government, right? Well, you think of armed forces, right? Military forces. The UN has got tens of thousands of these peace troops. Right now, officially, they work for their own government, but they're under UN command, running around the world, raping children. We'll get to that. Occupying nations. It's just absolutely grotesque. They've also got their own police forces. They've got the World Health Organization, the WHO. They've got UNESCO, the UN Education Agency. They've got an environmental agency. They've got a criminal court system, the International Criminal Court, where they claim they can prosecute anybody on the planet for unspecified violations. And by the way, I mentioned you don't have rights. You don't get any of those traditional rights that we take for granted as Americans in the UN's kangaroo court system. That's one of the reasons why the American government has never ratified the Rome statute that created the ICC, and yet they're all acting like it's totally legitimate. They've got a global patent office. They've got anything that you can think of that would normally be associated with the government. The UN has it. They've also got the IMF, which they're hoping will become the global central bank. It's not technically part of the UN, kind of like the Federal Reserve is not technically part of the U.S. government, but they work together in this criminal fraud. Speaking of fraud, the UN is absolutely, positively dominated by fraudsters and criminals, all of whom are hiding behind diplomatic immunity. In fact, there was a survey conducted by the UN's own investigators, and they found that 60% of the UN employees they polled said, and I'm quoting here, "Fraud goes unpunished in my workplace." Right? You can steal money, you can do whatever you want. As far as anybody knows, the other 40% might be involved in the fraud themselves, either that or they don't want to admit to the investigators what they know. But, fraud is bad enough. Stealing money, it's wrong, it shouldn't happen. Corruption is not good, but it pales in comparison with the massive rape spree that UN troops and UN bureaucrats have been involved in. In fact, over the last decade, according to the organization here, their cries incidentally made up of former high-ranking UN officials. More than 60,000 women and children have been raped by these UN peace troops and UN bureaucrats. We did a whole episode on the child-raping UN military. In one town in the Ivory Coast, in one Ivorian town, a 2008 survey by Save the Children revealed that 8 out of 10 minor girls said they were being regularly raped and sexually abused by these monsters with their goofy blue helmets. The people that George Bush said will implement the vision of the UN's founders. As if that wasn't all enough, they've got spies crawling all over our country using UN diplomatic cover to spy on us, to radicalize domestic subversives. It is unconscionable to have these fifth columnists, these occupying forces in our country, and worse, to give them diplomatic immunity. Basically, guys, the UN's goal, the goal of the deep state through the UN, is to impose global tyranny on the planet, and America is, on one hand, the primary financier of this whole abomination, right? We pay more than like 185 other governments combined, right? We're by far the largest financiers of this abomination. More than $10 billion a year, guys. That's just what we know about, okay? Imagine what we could do with $10 billion a year. We're borrowing money from China to build a world government. That is the dumbest thing in the universe. But there is a solution, guys, and this is, part of our mini-series in Behind the Deep State on solutions. There is a solution that would set the deep state's agenda back decades, if not generations, and that is to get us out of the United Nations. And that sounds a little bit far-fetched, but it's not nearly as far-fetched as you might think. In 2019, a coalition of liberty-minded congressmen, including Representative Mike Rogers of Alabama, Congressman Thomas Massey of Kentucky, introduced H.R. 204. It's called the American Sovereignty Restoration Act. It wasn't actually new. This has been introduced almost every Congress since the 1990s by Representative Ron Paul and other wonderful liberty-minded representatives. Another big supporter, of course, was Congressman Larry McDonald. He, incidentally, was a Democrat, wonderful, wonderful man, the chairman of the John Birch Society, which has been on this campaign for many, many decades. He was totally in favor of this effort until the Soviet Union shot his commercial airliner out of the sky in 1983 while he was on his way to Korea. Some of the concerns cited by the representatives who introduced this bill: UN attacks on our sovereignty, UN attacks on our gun rights, on our God-given rights, massive attacks on our Second Amendment through the Arms Trade Treaty, the constant demonization and attacks on the state of Israel. And just to get some sense of how crazy it is, I don't care what you think about Israel, you can't possibly think that over 90% of the resolutions picking on one country pick on Israel, right? What about North Korea? What about Iran? What about Sudan? What about China? Goodness gracious, ongoing genocide, right? The idea that 90+% of all the resolutions need to target Israel is just absolutely silly. That's got a lot of people upset. And now, and that's just scratching the surface of why these congressmen have introduced these bills. Now, under this short bill, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act, the U.S. would officially repeal the UN Participation Act. We would leave the UN and all of its agencies. We'd withdraw from all the UN agreements. We would stop funding all the UN programs. We would evict the spy and terrorist-infested UN headquarters from New York City. Maybe they could go take up a new headquarters in Havana or Tehran, maybe they'd like better. We would immediately prohibit the use of any U.S. military personnel or resources under UN command, right? So our troops would never be asked to put on those disgusting blue helmets and patches again. It's really a great bill, very simple, just a few pages. We caught up with Congressman Thomas Massey and asked him why he was co-sponsoring the bill. So check this out.
And the reason that I think we need to get out of the UN is, well, it's full of dictators, and it's also something that I don't think our sovereign government should defer to. For instance, a lot of these foreign relations bills that come in front of us in Congress, in the whereas clauses, they might say, whereas the UN has said this, or the UN decided this, now therefore be it resolved. Well, that's almost an automatic no for me, because why would I defer to the United Nations if we're a sovereign country? The best thing you can say about the United Nations is it's mostly ineffective and a waste of money. Like, that's the best thing you could say about it. So I'm glad that they're somewhat ineffective, but I don't like that we waste the money. We provide like 90% of the funding for the United Nations for their activities overseas, their intervention and whatnot. And so, the other countries who are in there, they don't pay their fair share, but a fair share would be zero, and we should get out.
And, this bill's getting more and more popular. We've had top conservatives, including Senator Rand Paul, said he'd be happy to see the UN dissolved. We've had Sarah Palin explicitly support this bill, leaving the UN. So just wonderful, wonderful things. We also have had on the campaign trail, Donald Trump has said some really, really powerful things about this. I can understand he was pretty upset with the UN. The human rights bureaucrat said he was like ISIS. But Donald Trump said the UN was not a friend of freedom or the United States. He said during the campaign that he would cancel UN agreements like the illegitimate Paris Agreement, which he actually did. And here's what he said. He said, when do you see the United Nations solving problems? They don't. They cause problems. I couldn't agree more, Mr. President. Thank you for pointing out that fact. Now, typically, establishment rhinos and Democrats on the House Foreign Affairs Committee have been able to keep this bill bottled up in the committee so that it doesn't go to a vote and the American people don't get to see which of their representatives support continuing to spend tens of billions of dollars on the dictators club that is the United Nations. But we do know that support for defunding the UN has been growing very rapidly in both houses of Congress on both sides of the aisle. As Representative Massey pointed out, when defunding the UN did come up for a vote, there were just 70 votes short of cutting off funding for the UN. That means they'd only have to flip 35 votes and the UN would be defunded. That would be a phenomenal start. Now, Donald Trump did a phenomenal job as president getting us out of UN agencies. He got us out of UNESCO. He got us out of the dictator-controlled UN Human Rights Council. He got us out of multiple UN agreements, the Paris Agreement, the UNRWA, all these different UN agencies and deals. He did. But unfortunately, ever since Joe Biden has been in office, we are now moving very quickly to re-engage with those things. Now, I know, abolishing the UN, or at least getting the United States out of it, seems like a tough goal, but it's possible, right? If there were enough pressure from the American people, we could get out of the UN tomorrow. All it would take is passing the bill, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act, and this would deal a devastating blow to the UN's agenda for world government. We would set this agenda back decades, maybe generations. Incredibly significant, guys. This would be such a blow. And even just the fact that the UN has become so delegitimized, I think has set back the deep state agenda for a long time. Now, to be clear, the UN itself is not the threat, right? The threat is the deep state that set up the UN and uses the UN as a tool. But if you want to defeat the deep state, one of the things you have to do is expose their tactics and neutralize their tools, their weapons. The UN is one of the most powerful weapons that the deep state has in waging war on America and pursuing this dream of totalitarian globalism. So if we could defang and then destroy the United Nations, it would just be absolutely phenomenal. It would set the deep state back so far. That's why they are so desperate, so anxious to preserve this United Abominations, as I call it. I got that from a rock song somewhere, if you're curious. But that's why they are so determined to preserve and protect the UN, and that is why people who love freedom, people who love their nation, people who love all that is good and right should be doing everything they can to help get us out of the UN. So call your member of Congress. Call them now. Call your senators and ask them to please co-sponsor the American Sovereignty Restoration Act. Get together with people in your community. Go organize a meeting with your member of Congress and explain to them it is unacceptable to spend one more American dollar on this disgusting dictators club filled with child rapists and criminals and dictators. They should have absolutely no power, absolutely no say, and their headquarters should not be located on American soil. Folks, a big project, I know, but an incredibly important one. Really appreciate you watching. I'm Alex Newman. This is Behind the Deep State. Thanks and God bless. If you liked this video, then click that subscribe button with the little bell. If you didn't like this video, you're probably a member of the Deep State. Am I wrong? Prove it. Hit the subscribe button. Just kidding. Thanks again, folks. God bless.